Howdy, all you delicious people. Groundhog Day. So, this movie opens the door for people to realize that, hey, how about we just make one broken record day? To ultimately, people keep saying the same lines over and over and over again, delivering the same day over and over and over again. And I think really this movie started off a genre of things like having a repeated day is what opened the door to eventually like movies like Happy Death Day, which I think is really a great concept, and eventually they had a sequel to follow that was just eh. But I really was fascinated by the fact of like, yeah, what if somebody was stuck in one day repetitiously and they had nothing but time on their hands? And I think this approach to this broken record day, I think really is like fairly interesting. You get it to where Phil ultimately is learning probably every single language known to man. He's probably learning. He's learning an instrument. He's learning to be able to break the law. He's learning to know how it feels like to figure out ways to end his days. Let's just say, which ultimately he tries to end his day, but it just like it doesn't work. So he has to keep trying and trying and trying, because ultimately he has lost all hope. He has lost all hope that he can get away from this day, and he's ultimately testing the waters to figure out how to get out of this day. And then, like, I find it interesting that you have it to where eventually, like, this guy has done this day so often that he realizes that the only real way to beat this day is to make one real and true ultimate day. Originally, when hearing, evidently, originally Tom Hanks was going to be in this role as Phil, but ultimately he turned it down because he realized that he is too lovable of an actor for people to like him being like this this kind of grumpy weatherman to transition into this much nicer guy towards the end of the movie. And ultimately, he said after watching this movie, like, I think Bill was a much more better choice for the role because you could buy him as this kind of grumpy person that eventually transitions into a much more lovable character. Like, I think kind of reasonably when looking at it, You've Got Mail was kind of Tom Hanks' approach at being like hated at first, but then eventually being loved at the end. So I think reasonably, I think Tom Hanks could have pulled off this character. It was just the fact that like it was probably just in the wrong time of his career because ultimately later on in Tom Hanks's career, he's kind of done much more of a wide range of spectrum of characters probably at that point toward doing somebody that isn't liked at first, but then eventually you grow to uh, like either see his point of view or just enjoy the character. Then like I think eventually it would be interesting to eventually actually see Tom Hanks try to be a villain in a movie. Like I honestly think that would be fascinating to just see like how they would approach that. Because normally he usually plays such a good person, or he usually plays the character you least expect to be a villain. More than likely, it would be interesting for him to be a villain in an animated movie. Because ultimately, I think you would be able to get away with that a lot easier. To ultimately have Tom Hanks like, yeah, I can be villains now, and no one will know it's me. because ultimately they'll just be thinking of this voice and not me actually being a villain. But anyways, I thought it was interesting that ultimately Andy McDowell, that ultimately was Rita. She had mentioned her time being with Bill Murray, and she had mentioned that, like, reasonably, she was just trying as much as possible to just kind of get out of Bill's way, like to just ultimately just kind of do whatever he wanted and do it however he wanted. Like, I could kind of see how maybe Andy could have maybe even gotten annoyed at some point with some of the stuff that like Bill was doing, because a lot of it was like a lot of it, yeah, could have been funny, but a lot of it could have also seemed like okay, why did he have to like do this way? Why couldn't like like really there was some stuff where I guess Bill was trying to be different, but then also I think that uh like that was probably pushing Andy a little bit too much at some point. And I don't know, it could be any number of things, but um, recently I think maybe a lot of people were, it was just like really hard to work with Bill just because maybe he goes off script, or maybe it's just you gotta really be on your toes when you're working with Bill. And that's always a good thing to be challenged, but also it's just I don't know. It could be any number of things. I like Bill Murray. I enjoy his work. Ultimately, it was interesting for me to hear eventually that Bill Murray was almost going to be Batman at some point. He was going to be uh, what was going to be Michael Keaton was going to be Bill Murray. I thought that was interesting. I was like, I would actually enjoy wanting to see that kind of take, to see Bill Murray try to be Batman. I think that might have worked out, but um, I just feel like Keaton was better. But anyways, so when knowing this movie, ultimately we have Harold Ramis being directing this film, which I'm like, okay, so we basically have uh, Harold, who ultimately has a small part in this role as a doctor, and recently it was just kind of interesting how I think Harold ultimately had some kind of knowledge of talking and kind of kind of researching the behind the scenes thing of like of a day that just goes over and over and over and over and over again. Like ultimately, kind of like went into it as a rabbi perspective, but recently he was like, yeah, I think there's a lot of people that feel like their days just kind of it's all the same, nothing ever changes, and like there's a lot of people that just kind of go insane over it, where it's just like they want something different, like uh, different is good, and a lot of people can't get that. A lot of people are had tried for years just to be able to get like one little difference in their life, and it doesn't happen, so they just kind of eventually just snap, or ultimately just get to the point of just like uh, just be like, okay, what do I need to wake up for? What do I need to do this for? What do I need to? And that's eventually when they just like they give up, they give in, they give whatever. But ultimately, when looking at it, that's where I think I could really enjoy this movie, because when looking at it also there's some people that that probably like me like feel like every day is just monotonous, like a holiday is just another day to you. And so recently when looking at it in that harsh reflection, um when looking at it, it's nice to eventually see a character that eventually takes his day in stride, and otherwise eventually just has people kind of flock to him, and ultimately just go like, oh my god, like this guy that I didn't know that all of a sudden just showed up in my town, all of a sudden is this superhero, and now everyone likes him. Uh, Now everyone is like, oh my god, like this guy, like he's great, and yeah, I think that's the best part of the movie. It's just the eventual silver lining that eventually comes from like Bill Murray hating this town and like couldn't wait to leave and hope that like some big gig was going to be coming for him, and that just never happened, to where ultimately he just learned to love everything, and ultimately instead of trying to fake what he was trying to do, he ended up making what he was trying to do. So let's go into spoilers. Let's talk about this. Ultimately, uh, like it's probably easy to memorize some lines and stuff like that, where reasonably, because within this one, like the lines could keep going over and over and over and over into a loop. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So yeah, I just love eventually having it be that there seems to be a trophy kind of at the end of this movie. Like we have it to where Phil is ultimately going into this day, and eventually he is just like, god, I want to win this woman over, I want to be able to have the perfect day, and I want to be able to get to the next day, is ultimately what I want change, I want something different, and ultimately that is the end goal. But in the very beginning of this story, you ultimately have it to where Phil is a weatherman that is ultimately talking about that there is going to be a blizzard that ultimately is going to push on to Altoona. Evidently, they're going to get some moisture. And so ultimately, we have it to where Bill is just doing the forecast and ultimately mentioning that he's going to Punxsutawney Phil or Punxsutawney, uh, Punxsutawney? Yeah, Phil is the groundhog. He's going to Punxsutawney to ultimately go and see the groundhog and ultimately see if they're going to have more winter. So reasonably, it seems that ultimately he calls his other anchor like hairdo, and because ultimately he is mentioning that he is gonna quite possibly get drafted to another anchor job or something like that, because it seems like somebody's going to try to steal him away. So we have it to where they push on to go into having Phil, Rita, and Larry going on their drive, and we have it to where Rita is ultimately the producer of all this, but eventually she becomes in a romantic entanglement with Phil's character. We ultimately have Larry, who is just the cameraman, that ultimately when hearing this movie, uh, I think Harold Ramis was ultimately asking Larry, Chris Elliott, is like, you know, you could probably have a bigger role than what you have in this movie, and I think Chris Elliott was just like, no, I really I want to play this camera guy. I think there's something there. I think I can do something with that. Because ultimately they were really trying to figure out where to put him, because ultimately they wanted him, but like ultimately this guy could have been any number of roles in this movie, but he just ended up being Larry the cameraman. So we go on here, and ultimately we have that Rita is such like a bubbly personality that I really enjoy. With that usually combats consistently with Phil, where reasonably Phil is just kind of the like I'm going to make fun of the Rita that, or I'm going to make fun of Rita, who is very much a like too much sunshine in Phil's consistent clouding of days of sorts. So we have it to uh, where Rita ultimately mentions like how like excited that she is to go to Punxsutawney, and that ultimately she can't wait for like, yeah, I can't wait for the groundhog to come out. And, like a little cute, and and we ultimately have a tour like Phil's like, did you like, should I get a mirror for you so that way you can see the little face that you just did when you talked about the groundhog? Like, hey, would you like some blood sausage? I have some blood sausage in my in my glove compartment. And ultimately, Rita's like, I love blood sausage. Like, you kind of gotta wonder sometimes if a lot of like the back and forth bickering that they were doing were just like ad libbing or whatever. Because I think it's really fun, even though it's probably just like back and forth, just like ad libbing and whatever. But so we eventually, a lot of the times uh, we have it to where they move on to ultimately go into they are ultimately just kind of simply getting their arrangements of which place that they're going to be at. It seems that Phil had been at the establishment that ultimately Rita and Larry had been before, and he's like, "No, I don't want to go here. Like, I want to go somewhere else." And so ultimately, we have Rita and Larry tell Phil, "It's like, oh no, we said you somewhere else. It's another B&B, bread and breakfast." So he goes there, and of course, there is absolutely no hot water. And reasonably, of course, they're not going to be able to get hot water on that day. And uh, and so ultimately, we have tour pushing on. So we have a tour. Rita and Larry and Phil, they all go to sleep, and they wake up the next day. And here's where we have the repeated day over and over and over again. So we ultimately have it to where at the very beginning of this whole thing, we have, of course, the radio station that ultimately goes into like, get your booties out there, or because it's gonna be cold out there. It's cold out there every day, and so on and so forth. And so ultimately, they talked about chapped lips and stuff like that, and ultimately talk about the blizzard that they're going to get in. And so ultimately, we have it to where we have Phil, who consistently goes and peeks his head out to the window to just kind of see like what all everyone's doing, and he consistently through certain days like does that. And so eventually we have it to where ultimately Phil is to try like the first day he tries to get hot water, but then ultimately he's like, "Oh my god!" Because of course there would be hot water that day because there's a blizzard, of course, coming, and we have Miss Lancaster that ultimately he consistently goes to. On some days, he ends up, of course, just asking like if from the day he had before, if it's gonna kind of like affect this day, but it won't. At some points, he's also just simply asking her for toaster, or and every single time Lancaster ultimately asks like, "Hey, are you going to be leaving today? Is this going to be your like last day?" And like at first he mentions he's like, "Well, 100% departure and stuff like that." Like I think the very first day he ultimately like gives her a weather report, and ultimately says that it's going to be 100% that he's going to depart because ultimately he's going to try to get the news later on, or get back to the news later on, so that way he can do a report. So, but then eventually, when we have this broken record day, ultimately he ends up just reasonably just deciding to he reasonably just decides to otherwise just go like, well, maybe 80%, maybe 70, maybe like 50%, and then he's like, nah, I'll just stay here. So we have it to where uh, Phil ultimately goes out and ultimately meets people. He always sees a homeless man, which ultimately he normally does not give any money to, and then ultimately he bumps into Ned Ryerson. That ultimately is a insurance guy that ultimately uh, was a person that ultimately Ned is a backstory that helps us understand Phil a little bit more of his past, because ultimately we have Ned who is trying to have a backstory for uh, Phil to remember. Ultimately mentioning that Phil had dated, I think, or that Ned had dated Phil's sister until he told him not to. And so ultimately, like Ned's name, I think, was Ned the Head and stuff like that. And so, like, we have this whole like backstory like presented of this character, but we are also to realize that like Phil is really annoyed with this character, and so ultimately a lot of times he tends to avoid the character. He tends to like he punches him out. He runs away from him, and all kinds of other funny scenarios. I think the funniest one is eventually when he full on like embraces Ned and ultimately tells him it's like, hey, like wherever you're going, could you call off sick? And then ultimately Ned's like, ew, well, I don't think so, Phil. I need to be going. So you ultimately have it to where on this first day, Phil ends up landing in this bit of slosh, and ultimately Ned is like, ew, watch your step there. It's a doozy. And so at some points we have it to where other people accidentally hit into the slosh spot, or ultimately uh, Phil ends up like stopping before he hits the sloshed part, so that way someone else hits it. But anyways, we have it to where eventually Phil makes his way to um, he ends up making his way to the, of course, place where they are having Phil do his unveiling of whether or not he sees Winter. And so we have a tour. There's a bunch of people that are all at Gobbler's Knob to just do this weird polka ash like dancing, because there's a lot of polka going on. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil just kind of is just like, dude, I just want to get this done. Like the first day, he's like, dude, I just like let's roll. Like I don't really care. Like let's just get this done. And so ultimately, we have it to where Phil ultimately does the run, and then ultimately you have it to where we have to where the Phil Groundhog ultimately comes out, and ultimately we have it the entire time where Phil is just like, yeah, like in this like, hey, look, we have the groundhog come out, the rodent or the whatever, the and man, do they like look at them, they're just like they're like he's given a play by play of what all is going on. And right after that, we have it to where Phil ultimately finishes up. I think he ultimately also gives like the finger at one time. So we have it to where Rita is like, well, that sounds great and all, but could you drop the sarcasm and try it again? And Phil's like, we got it. Like, if anything, there are times when ultimately he tries to do the report anyways, but a lot of times he gets just more to the point of like, who cares? So he can just say anything. But then eventually, towards the very tail end of this movie, he gives uh, this amazing speech and stuff like that. Because eventually he turns into just like, well, how would I just give like uh, the best kind of thing that I could possibly give, and like ultimately it's just kind of interesting to have Phil consistently meet this one guy that walks up the stairs in the hotel before Phil goes out to his to do his camera work, and we have the guy's like, "Do you think it's going to be an early spring?" And we have it to where uh, Phil is ultimately saying, "No, I think it's going to be March so and so day." And the guy's like, "Well, I think that's exactly when spring actually starts." But then eventually he gets to a better mood, and ultimately he tells this guy, "It's like, yes, like I think at one point, like he mentions that it's like he kind of does like some Shakespearean where it's like." Here's a man here, a smile on his face and hope of spring, and and Terrell and he's like ciao, and then he like walks off because he knows he gets to the point where he knows he knows every single thing about every single person in this town. Ultimately, he knows the best way to talk to them because we have it to where like eventually we have to where Phil is knowing every single thing about every single person. And so at first he ends up trying to play them all, but then he realizes that he's like, well, like this day is never going to end with me just trying to play devil's advocate with everybody. So how about I just turn a leaf and then just be like try to do the best day that I ever can, and that's what ultimately he eventually does. So we have it to where we have Phil that ultimately after this thing is shot and Phil is done, we eventually have it to where they go to this diner to ultimately they have to hear that a guy is going to drop a thing of plates, and we eventually have them come in there and ultimately say like, oh okay, well hey, do you guys want to go out, you want to get ahead of the weather? And so we end up finding that Phil ends up going out to get out of this blizzard because ultimately he was like, no, this blizzard is going to hit Altoona, and reasonably it's like, well, hey, that uh, that moisture's on your head, buddy. Because we ultimately have it to where Phil ultimately tries to leave, and there is a pile up because, or there's just an inability to be able to get out of this blizzard, and so we have a tour. Phil is kind of making all kinds of phone calls. He's ultimately like calling an emergency line because like he's ultimately asking people. It's like, well, I'm a celebrity that's in an emergency, and so like, isn't like there a way that ultimately I can get out of this town? And ultimately, like no one is going to ultimately say yes to Phil. So it seems like Phil is just stuck in this town, and ultimately it's funny enough when they get into the other days or the other same days to ultimately they have it to where like Rita ultimately asks Phil, it's like, well, I thought the blizzard was going to hit Altoona and we weren't going to have the problem with the weather, because ultimately just putting egg on Phil's face because ultimately he had said that. But anyways, we have it to where Phil is ultimately going to the very next day and ultimately realizing that the same radio station is on. And he's like, hey guys, you're playing yesterday's tape. Like, what's going on? So, eventually it gets to the point where Phil, at one of the days, he ends up kind of like repeating a lot of stuff that they say, like chap lips, and so on and so forth. So eventually we have it to where seemingly Phil on this second broken record day, it seems that he is asking people, it's like, you ever heard of deja vu? And like, because people are consistently asking him the same question, it gets to the point to where eventually he makes his way onto uh like asking people. He opens a window and he's like, hey, where are you guys all going? And he's like, and they ultimately say Gobbler Knob, Gobbler's Knob, it's Groundhog's Day. And he's like, it's like, it is just once a year, isn't it? It's like Groundhog's Day was yesterday. Like, what are you guys doing? And so ultimately, we have it to where Miss Lancaster ultimately have Phil ultimately saying that, like, hey, have you ever felt deja vu? And ultimately, you have it to where Mrs. Lancaster's like, no, but I'll see if our one of our chefs can make it, because ultimately she's thinking it's a dinner order. And we ultimately have it to where Phil is like, no, never mind. And then ultimately we have Miss Lancaster asking again. It's like, well, do you think there's a chance for you to depart today? And he's like, well, 70, 80% chance. So again, we have it to where ultimately Phil goes to Gobbler's Knob and has to do the same thing that he did the day before. And we have it to where Phil this time around is ultimately asking Rita, it's like, could you give me a good hard slap? It's like I'm like, it feels like every single thing that I've done, like I've already done all of this. And because ultimately we have it to where Phil meets Ned again and does every single thing that he had done previously. And so eventually when he goes to Rita, he's like, could you give me a good hard slap? And so ultimately we have it to where Phil is ultimately just kind of doing the giving up doing the news report this time around, because it's like, dude, we got this. We already did this. And ultimately we have it to where we have the same stuff all over again. We have Rita that ultimately says, isn't he cute, as they bring out the groundhog. And ultimately they tell us that there's more winter to predict, because we ultimately have to where Phil is like, yeah, it's Groundhog's Day again. And so now we're going to have Phil come out and tell us how much more winter we're supposed to expect. So we have it to where, yeah, we have it to where we have here that after this second day, it just becomes very like more and more and more repetitive. To ultimately you just get like towards like several variations of a day after this, because everything just kind of becomes to like the broken records of certain days at some point. So you ultimately have it to where at some takes of the diner. So we have it to where eventually it seems that Phil is ultimately complaining to Rita. It's like, God, I feel really, really weird. like, could you help me? Like, could you like figure something out? Eventually, it gets to the point to where eventually uh, Phil goes to see a doctor who is ultimately Harold Ramis, and ultimately like, well, there's no spots, there's no lesions. Like, I don't know, there's nothing I can help you with. If anything, uh, I can send you to a specialist, but that's could be outside of Pittsburgh. And Phil ultimately mentions like, well, I can't get out of Pittsburgh because ultimately the blizzard is coming. And And then so this doctor pushes Phil on to see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is like, "Well, yeah, I'm kind of out of my element here. It's like I just work with couples, and I have an alcoholic now, and so reasonably the psychologist cannot be able to figure out how to deal with Phil, but ultimately he's asking like, well, how about we see each other again tomorrow? And then Phil's like, God, I don't have a tomorrow. I don't have a tomorrow. So we have it to where eventually, so we just kind of have to kind of push on through all of the takes of all of the days. So we have it to where we have Phil eventually trying to mass manipulate people. We have a tour of Phil ultimately tries to get Nancy, ultimately asking what school she had gone to and all this information. And to ultimately, the very next day, he ultimately comes to her and says, Nancy from such and such high school? Phil Connors. And ultimately, like, Nancy's like, oh yeah, I remember you. And he's like, yeah, I was short, but I was proud of it, it's like, God, you look great, and blah blah blah, and just like trying to catch up with a person that he doesn't really know. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil is winning this girl over, and to the point to where eventually he is like getting easily into bed with her, and the entire time he is saying that she's Rita instead of Nancy, and Nancy is just like, who's Rita? And he's like, I don't know. To where eventually Nancy's like, are you sure that that you really like me and whatever? And Phil's like, well, you know what, Rita? I think like Rita, will you be my wife? And Nancy's like, oh, Phil. It's like, such hilarious moments. And so we ultimately have it to where like days go by, and we ultimately have Phil who steals money from these two elderly guys that are from the bank or whatever. And eventually we have a tour. Phil drives to a movie theater in a Rolls Royce, and with some girl on his arm. And ultimately Nancy walks by, and he's like, Nancy, hey. And she walks away not knowing him. He's like, yeah, that's my old fiance from another life. So we ultimately push on. So eventually we have it to where it gets to the point to where Phil wants to know everything about everybody. But before that, we have it to where Phil realizes that there is no tomorrow, there is no consequences. And so ultimately, he does a ton of crimes with these two drunk guys uh, right before they were in a bowling alley. We have it to where Phil reflects on the best day that he's ever had, and he's like, why didn't I get that day over and over and over? And so we have it to where Phil is ultimately looking at a glass as half empty instead of half full. And so reasonably we have it to where uh, Phil is, once he gets into the car with these two drunk guys, he's like, you know what, maybe my glass is half full. And so now I can do whatever I want. He crashes his car into a mailbox, ultimately drives on the railroad tracks, and ultimately is to land in prison. But then ultimately he wakes up the next day back in the hotel as per usual. There's some interesting scenes of which we're ultimately we have a montage of Bill eventually waking up to this alarm clock, where eventually he like smashes the alarm clock, or he chucks it, or he whatever. Like, I think interesting enough, once I think he gets to the second day, he breaks a pencil, then wakes up the next day to see the pencil is fine. So we get further along into, we have Phil ultimately trying to get to know everybody in town slowly but surely, but he also wants to get to know Rita. He wants to be able to figure out the perfect thing to ultimately uh, get the perfect date out of Rita. To where we have it to where Phil ultimately is taking down notes of every single day for Rita, so that way he can get a perfect date out of her. And he thinks that maybe that perfect date and winning her over is going to ultimately win him and finish this day. But it doesn't work out that way. So we ultimately have it to where Phil ultimately goes and orders the same drink that Rita drinks, and ultimately she's like, "Oh my god, that's my favorite drink." So we ultimately have it to where Rita and Phil are talking about their past, and Rita mentions that she had done French poetry, and we have a tour at the first take. Bill's like, "Why would you do French poetry? That sounds like the oddest thing to do." It's like, nah, you seem like you wasted your time, your life. But then eventually in the second day, we have a tour where Phil ultimately starts speaking French poetry, and like, because basically Phil knows I guess the perfect way to eventually win this girl over is to basically just like, okay, well, this wasn't working. Well, this is what I was saying wasn't working. So it kind of just gets to the point where ultimately Phil just kind of just miraculously just decides to like, well, if this person ultimately wants me to know some little something about them, then I'm going to try to figure out the perfect way to be able to counter attack that at some point. Because we eventually have Phil at some point hearing an interesting playing of a piano on a radio, and he ultimately ends up paying off this piano teacher $1,000 to eventually start lessons. And so ultimately we have to where Phil ultimately learns how to play the piano. So, but if anything, we have it to where Phil is trying to make the perfect date out of Rita, and every single time, every single day, is ending up with a slap in the face repetitiously, to the point where I think Phil is ultimately just kind of tired of seeing Rita, like just tired of everything, and ultimately for Phil to not win over Rita really just pushes Phil over the edge. Because reasonably, if you can't win over the love of your life, then reasonably, like, I can eventually see how that would just really crush a person. So we have it to where Phil ultimately is going on after just being just repetitiously slapped by Rita over and over and over and over again, because there are points when he had a perfect day that ultimately landed him into like falling accidentally right next to Rita and them kissing, but then he tries to recreate that fall and it doesn't come out as good as it originally was, and ultimately she realizes that. And so like Phil trying to recreate a perfect day or perfect parts of a day just comes off as fake, as flawed, as just like, okay, you just wanted to do this to get next to me, and every little thing that Phil tries to do eventually goes into eventually Rita ultimately realizing that, oh my god, like, did you find out from all my best friends like every single perfect little thing that ultimately I liked? And like, have you been stalking me and this and that? And Phil's like, no, it's real. All this is real. And we have it to where Rita ultimately says, well, I didn't like fudge and white chocolate. And ultimately feels like, okay, you don't like white chocolate and you don't like fudge. Okay, I'll remember that. And she's like, what are you doing? It's like, are you creating a list of things I like and don't like? And so every little thing that Phil tries to do, there's no mathematical equation to win over this girl. Everything that he tries to recreate, ultimately just turns Rita off. So he gives up winning Rita over, and he pretty much almost gives up on everything to the point of uh, we have it to where Phil mentioning to Rita, because ultimately when he comes to her and she's like, and they do the report again. Ultimately, she's like, "Hey, Phil, you had a long day," and Phil's just like, like I tried to win you over so badly, and it's never going to work." And so ultimately, we have it to where Phil goes on the camera this time around. He's like, "Yeah, it's gonna be cold, and it's gonna be cold. It's gonna be winter. It's gonna be cold, and it's gonna last you for the rest of your life." Trolls me at the very. I think at this one at the very tail end of it, he gives the camera the finger, and ultimately you have it to where Phil tells Rita, "It's like, you know what? I just want to tell you that we had a really perfect day once," and but like I think now like this groundhog is just he's just gonna keep seeing his shadow, and so like I just need to make it stop. So ultimately we have it to where uh because ultimately Bill's brother is actually in this movie. He ultimately is playing I think the mayor of this town, and so it seems like there is those two guys ultimately buy some truck, and Phil eventually commandeers this truck with the groundhog in it to ultimately um, take both Phils out all in one shot. Ultimately, Phil drives off a cliff to ultimately end both Groundhog and Self. So we end up having to where Phil ultimately lives through this day to wake up at 6 a.m. again to this radio, and he's like, ah, nuts. And so ultimately, he just decides every single day to attempt some way to end it all. And we eventually have at one point earlier on where to where Phil is just eating nonstop into the diner, and Rita is ultimately just going like aren't you worried about cholesterol, cancer, anything like that? And he's like, I don't have to worry about anything anymore. I don't even have to worry about flossing. like I don't have to worry about anything at all. Like I don't have to worry about gaining weight, nothing. And so eventually we have it to where Phil has tried everything under the sun to like falling off of a church, uh, and to the point where he mentions that he's gotten like he gets run over by a truck, and so eventually he goes to Rita and ultimately mentions like I am a god, like I am not the god, but I am a god, and we have it to where Phil mentions is like I cannot die. I've been poisoned, shot, stabbed, everything under the sun, and I can't die. And so Rita's like yeah, there's no way that you're a god. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so ultimately, we have it to where uh, Phil has to rationalize all of this to Rita, and basically he gets to the point where he mentions every single person in the diner, every little thing about them, and like I thought that this moment is probably the best moment of this movie, where ultimately Phil is getting to where he is telling Rita, it's like, yeah, in 3 seconds there's going to be there's going to be plates that end up falling, and so ultimately 3, 2, 1, yeah, hey, yeah, just put it wherever, buddy. So we have it to where ultimately Rita goes and clings herself on to Phil as an experiment to just kind of see what happens. We eventually have it to where uh, Phil writes down word for word what Larry is going to tell her about getting ahead of the weather. And we ultimately at some point have it to where Phil ultimately uh, wrecks or takes a piece out of the van to ultimately the car or the van won't be able to start. So there's a reason for them to stop asking him to try to leave. So we end up having Larry, or we end up having it to where uh, Rita and Phil ultimately seemingly have a day together, and eventually leads to uh, Phil flipping cards into a hat or a top hat, and ultimately Rita is mentioning is like, yeah, there's no way I'm gonna get good at this, and ultimately Phil's like, yeah, like if you train for 6 months, you're gonna get really good at it. So eventually we have it to where Rita and Phil are ultimately just they end up sleeping together because Phil ends up reading uh, some poetry, and because Rita is assessing, it's like, well, like so, like midnight, I'm gonna be like gone, right? And Phil's like, oh no, like it only works till 6 a.m. And she's like, you knew I was waiting till midnight, and so ultimately pushes on. So we have it to where Phil and Rita ultimately are sleeping together. Well, Rita is falling asleep next to Phil. And so we have this beautiful moment, and the best part about this movie where Phil is confessing to Rita while she's asleep that ultimately she is like like this is such a heartbreaking moment. We have it to where Phil is just confessing to her, and ultimately mentioning that like that she's not what he deserves, but he had tried so hard in that, and so we eventually have it to where Phil wakes up the next day and ultimately realizes like, well, hey, like how about I turn over a new leaf? How about this time around I just make the best of my day, because if anything I had the best night with the great gal, and so finally now I'm just going to turn it over a new leaf and try to make a perfect day to where I take the time to get to know everybody because I have all the time in the world. Ultimately, getting donuts, pastry Larry, and eventually learning if Larry has any kids. So we have it to where eventually it gets down to the point to where it seems that Phil ends up trying to help everybody in this town, even the homeless person that at first he didn't give money to, but eventually he gives him soup and all kinds of things. And ultimately, it seems that at the tail end of this day, every single time, this guy ends up dying. So we find out that eventually Phil ultimately is trying to save every single person in this town. If there is someone who's choking, he tries to do the Heimlich to prevent them from choking, and so on and so forth. And the old ladies end up getting a flat tire. Phil is there uh, to help them out, and so one kid ends up falling out of a tree. Phil catches them and ultimately mentions like, "You've never thanked me." I'll see you tomorrow, maybe. So we have it to where Phil ends up going and creating this perfect day to where every single time, like there's even a person that doesn't have a lighter, and so ultimately Phil gives them a light. So we eventually push on to have Phil do this big old piano performance at this dance thing, and to where everybody's in town is at this dance thing. So eventually, Phil is playing the piano and getting everybody out to the dance floor, and we have it to where Rita is just so godsmacked that Phil is ultimately being this piano player, but ultimately I think at one point I saw that he was an ice sculpturist at one point. So we have it to where Phil is playing the piano, and so ultimately he kind of transitions for his teacher to play the piano, and she's like ultimately so proud of her student, which is Bill's character. So we have it to where Rita and Phil ultimately dance while the band is playing, and so ultimately, while Rita and Phil are uh, dancing it out, we have it to where Rita's like, "Oh my god, like I didn't know that you played," and stuff like that. So Phil's like, "Yeah, I'm very versatile." So we have it to where Phil ultimately is dancing with Rita, and there's tons and tons of people that go to Phil, ultimately kissing him or thanking him for something that he ended up doing. Evidently, there was one scene, I guess, that got cut out of the film or something like that, where ultimately Phil had saved some couple's marriage. I think the groom ultimately was the guy who played General Zod on Man of Steel, and ultimately they end up going to WrestleMania, and I thought that that was hilarious. So we ultimately have it to where uh, the groom ends up kissing Rita, and then the bride ends up stealing her groom away to get out of there. So we have it to where Rita is just godsmacked by all these people just coming up and thanking Phil for whatever bizarre reason. And ultimately, she's like, "What is going on with you in this town? Like, how often have you been in this town?" He's like, "No, I've just been in here today. Just like, yeah, I'm just fairly popular. I don't know why." So you ultimately have it to where they end up going and auctioning seemingly a people of the town for charity. Ultimately, we have Bill's brother, who is ultimately Brian Doyle-Murray, who ultimately is seen in a cluster of just kind of a cluster of films and stuff like that, Caddyshacks, and just a lot of like Saturday Night Live actually like things as well. I saw on Wayne's World recently, and so on and so forth. Vegas Vacation or Christmas Vacation, I mean, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. So they ultimately have it to where evidently his name is Buster. Yeah, he was the one who was choking on the cow. So we have it to where Murray goes up in there, Buster, ultimately to auction off Phil, because ultimately we have the waitress that was at the diner that's like, "I got $50. It says you're mine." And so ultimately Phil goes up there, and it seems like there is a bidding war between Nancy and between the waitress. But then eventually we have a tour. Of course, Rita ends up going and uh, like seeing whatever money that she has in her purse. It was like 300 and something dollars and 57 cents or something like that. And ultimately we have it to where uh, Murray goes, or Buster goes, "Sold for the lady of 300 and something dollars and 58 cents." So we ultimately have it to where eventually Larry goes up there, and we have it to where an old lady buys him for like a quarter or something like that. And I feel so bad for Larry. And ultimately, I remember him in Cabin Boy. So we ultimately have Bill, who is ultimately going to quickly carve up a ice sculpture of Rita, so that way she can get her money's worth because she paid top dollar for him. So you ultimately have it to where ultimately that that she loves it, and ultimately they eventually end up sleeping in the same bed, and so we have it to where Phil is to wake up the next day listening to, of course, the same song that he's heard over and over and over again. But this time around, we have it to where Rita is ultimately going, "Yeah, it's too early." And Bill is ultimately going like, "Huh? Like, I have a hand on my chest." And ultimately, we have it to where Phil is ultimately saying like, "Well, why are you here?" And Rita says like, "Well, you said stay, so I stayed." He's like, you stayed? Like, I couldn't make a collie stay. But you stayed? And she's like, yeah. So we have it to where Phil is like mentioning like anything different is good, and I think that that's a really interesting quote. So we have to where Bill is just kind of scrambling around to see if the day is really and truly different, and it is. And he's like, oh my god, like tomorrow it happened. And so reason we have it to where um, Phil and Rita are so excited, they're ultimately kind of running out of the building, and ultimately Phil goes to Rita and is like, "How about we live here? We'll rent." And so ultimately we have a tour. They end up like running out, and we end up having Phil ending up like kind of grabbing Rita over the railing, and we have a tour. Phil ultimately just kind of hops over, and they end up just kind of walking out onto the town, and that's how the movie just ends. Um, I think there was a lot of stuff that I tried as quickly as possible to skip over, and really I enjoy this movie. I've seen it like I think there was one point where I just started just watching this movie, and I just kept watching it over and over and over and over and over and over again at some point. So reason there's a lot of points where I just kind of can reflect on this movie and enjoy it for it being a movie that kind of does give you hope that, and I think that's what this movie really does represent to me is it really just represents hope. It really represents a possibility uh, of being able to find some way to get a better to have a better life for yourself or make a better life for yourself within uh, kind of uh, difficult circumstances and this and that. So that's what I like about it. Uh, but yeah, I try to skip over a lot of stuff. I know there was some kind of like tail ends of some characters and stuff like that, like kind of Ned, how he ended up uh, having Phil buy every single piece of life insurance that he could afford, and and then some. And ultimately, I'm sure there's probably some like days or whatever that kind of skipped around about. There might be some days that might have been more important to this and that and other people. Uh, but yeah, I didn't want to take way too much time. I just kind of wanted to get this done kind of quickly. So, because ultimately I could have spent hours just like, yeah, and in so and so day, he said all of this and that. So I just wanted to skip around a little bit. But, anyways, I love this movie. I enjoy it, and ultimately couldn't avoid once I just kind of saw a little blip on like Facebook or something of Groundhog's Day. I was like, you know what, like I'll talk about this one again and go into it, and I just took the time to watch it. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.